New York City, 1936. 18-year-old Ella Fitzgerald sat in a cramped radio station control room, about to hear a recording of her own voice for the very first time. She had no idea that what she was about to hear would make her want to quit music entirely. This is the story of the moment Ella heard herself sing and thought she sounded terrible, of telling Chick Webb she wanted to stop performing, of the insecurity that almost ended her career before it truly began, and of how the voice the entire world would come to love was a voice she could never stand to hear. Ella had been singing professionally for about 2 years by early 1936. That night at the Apollo Theater Amateur Contest in November 1934 had changed everything. She'd won, impressed drummer Chick Webb, and been invited to join his orchestra as their vocalist. At just 17 years old. She'd gone from homeless and desperate to performing at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem with one of the hottest bands in jazz. It had been a whirlwind. Suddenly Ella was performing every night, recording in studios, traveling to gigs across the Northeast. She was making actual money, not much, but enough to eat, to rent a room, to send a little back to family. She was singing in front of hundreds of people who danced to the music and seemed to enjoy her voice. But Ella had never actually heard what she sounded like. This seems impossible to modern ears. How could you sing for 2 years and not know what you sounded like? But in 1936, there were no easy ways to hear yourself. There were no smartphones to record on, no cassette players, no simple playback devices. If you wanted to hear a recording of yourself, you needed access to professional equipment, expensive transcription discs, or radio station playback systems. When Ella sang, she heard her voice from inside her own head the way everyone hears themselves. That internal sound, conducted through bone and tissue, sounds completely different from how others hear you. Your own voice in your head is deeper, richer, more resonant. The voice that comes out of your mouth and travels through air to other people's ears. That's different, often jarringly different. Ella had been told she had a good voice. Chick Webb wouldn't have hired her otherwise. Audiences seemed to like her. Reviews in the black press mentioned her favorably, so she assumed she sounded good, professional. She wasn't entirely sure what she sounded like, but people's reactions suggested it was working. Then came the radio broadcast in early 1936. Chick Webb's orchestra was booked for a live radio performance, one of the big band remote broadcasts that were popular at the time. The show would be performed live from a ballroom or club, with microphones carrying the music to radio stations and then into homes across the city and region. This was a big deal. Radio exposure meant reaching thousands of people who might never come to the Savoy. It meant prestige, recognition, potentially bigger bookings. Ella was nervous. Performing live was one thing. You sang, people reacted, it was over. But radio was permanent in a way live shows weren't. People would hear you in their homes. Your voice would be broadcast into living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms. And there was no visual element to hide behind, just your voice, naked and exposed. What if I mess up? Ella asked. Chick Webb during rehearsal. You won't mess up, Chick said. He had faith in her, even when she didn't have faith in herself. Just sing like you always do. Don't think about the microphones. The broadcast went well. Ella sang several numbers with the orchestra. She didn't mess up any lyrics, didn't miss any cues, hit her notes cleanly. The band sounded tight. The remote engineer gave them a thumbs up. It had been a success. A few days later, someone at the radio station mentioned that they'd made a transcription disc of the broadcast, a special recording that captured the live performance. These transcription discs were used for various purposes, archiving broadcasts, sending programs to other stations, sometimes just keeping a record of what had aired. Would you like to hear it? The engineer asked Chick. I can play it back for you. Chick was interested. He liked to hear how the band sounded on air, to know if the mix was good, if anything needed adjusting for future broadcasts. Sure, he said. Then he turned to Ella. You want to hear yourself on the radio? Ella hesitated. Part of her was curious. She'd never heard a recording of her own voice. Part of her was nervous. What if she didn't sound as good as she'd thought? Okay, she said, trying to sound casual. Let's hear it. They gathered in the small control room. Chick, a couple of band members, Ella, and the radio engineer. The engineer put the transcription disc on the playback turntable, adjusted some levels, and pressed play. The orchestra came through the speakers first. Ella could hear the band, horns, drums, bass. It sounded good, professional, like a real recording. Then her voice came in, and Ella felt her stomach drop. That couldn't be her. That high, thin, childish voice coming through the speakers. That wasn't what she sounded like. That couldn't be what other people heard when she sang. She sounded like a little girl, like someone who didn't belong on a professional stage, like someone pretending to be a singer rather than actually being one. The voice coming from the speakers was nothing like what Ella heard in her own head when she sang. In her head, her voice sounded fuller, richer, more mature. This voice, this was reedy, almost nasal, lacking depth and power. "That's not what I sound like," Ella said quietly. Chick was listening to the playback, nodding along. "Sounds good," he said. "Good balance with the horns." "No," Ella said more urgently. "That's not what I sound like." "That can't be me." Chick looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "That's you singing. That's how you sound." "I sound like a child." "You sound like Ella Fitzgerald," Chick said. "That's how you always sound." But Ella couldn't accept it. This couldn't be real. She sounded terrible. How had no one told her? How had audiences not laughed her off stage? How had Chick hired her in the first place? The playback continued. Ella heard herself sing verse after verse, and with each line she became more convinced that her voice was awful. Too high, too thin, no richness, no depth, just a thin, reedy sound that shouldn't be on any professional recording. When the playback ended, the engineer said cheerfully, "Sounds great, good broadcast." Ella said nothing. She walked out of the control room through the radio station corridors out onto the New York City street and just kept walking. She didn't go back to her rented room. She didn't go to the Savoy. She just walked through Harlem, replaying that voice in her head. That thin, terrible voice. Her voice. How had she been so wrong about herself? She'd thought she sounded professional, mature, good. Instead, she sounded like a kid playing at being a singer. She thought about the audiences who'd been polite, who'd applauded. Had they been humoring her? Being kind to a young girl who was trying hard but didn't really have talent. She thought about the reviews that had mentioned her favorably. Had they been grading on a curve, praising her for being okay considering her age and inexperience rather than actually being good? The more Ella thought about it, the more convinced she became she didn't belong in professional music. She'd gotten lucky at the Apollo, impressed Chick in a moment, but now the truth was clear. That voice on the radio, that thin, childish voice, that was the reality, and it wasn't good enough. By the time Ella found herself back near the Savoy Ballroom that evening, she'd made a decision. She was going to quit, tell Chick she couldn't do this anymore, find some other kind of work, stop pretending to be something she wasn't. She found Chick backstage before the evening's performance. "I can't do this anymore," Ella said. Chick looked up from his drum kit. "Can't do what?" "Sing, perform, any of it. I'm not good enough." Chick stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "My voice. I heard it on the radio. I sound terrible. I sound like a child. I don't know why. You hired me, but I can't keep doing this when I sound like that." Chick put down his drumsticks. He looked at Ella carefully, seeing that she was serious, that this wasn't false modesty or fishing for compliments. She genuinely believed what she was saying. "Ella," he said slowly, "you sound exactly like you're supposed to sound. That voice you heard on the radio, that's the voice that won the Apollo contest. That's the voice that packed this ballroom. That's the voice that every person out there tonight is coming to hear. But it sounds so thin, it sounds clear, it sounds pure, it sounds like nobody else. It sounds childish, it sounds young, you are young, but it also sounds skillful. You have perfect pitch, you never miss a note, you can follow any tempo change I throw at you. That voice you hate, other singers would kill for it." Ella shook her head. "You don't understand. When I sing in my head, I sound different, fuller, more mature, but that's not what comes out. What comes out is this thin little voice that doesn't sound professional." Chick nodded. "I know, everyone hates how they sound on recordings. It's because you hear yourself different in your own head. But the voice on that radio broadcast, that's what everyone else has been hearing all along, and they love it." "How can they love that?" "Because it's beautiful, because it's precise, because it carries emotion without forcing it, because it sounds effortless even when you're doing something technically difficult." Ella wanted to believe him, but the memory of that voice, her voice, coming through the speakers was too fresh, too painful. "I don't think I can keep singing if that's what I sound like," she said quietly. Chick stood up. He took Ella by the shoulders and looked her directly in the eyes. "Listen to me. You are 18 years old. You have been singing professionally for less than 2 years, and you are already one of the best vocalists I've ever worked with. That voice you heard on the radio, that voice is going to make you famous. That voice is going to make you rich. That voice is going to change music. But only if you don't quit because of some stupid recording. It's not stupid, it is stupid. You're hearing yourself for the first time and you hate it because it's different from what you expected. Everyone goes through this. Every singer who's ever heard themselves recorded thinks they sound terrible at first. but you have to trust everyone else's ears instead. Ella was crying now. I thought I sounded better than that. You sound exactly as good as everyone keeps telling you that you sound. The problem isn't your voice, the problem is your expectations. And you have to let go of those expectations and trust that the voice you have, the voice on that recording, is the right voice, the perfect voice, the voice that's going to change your life. They stood there for a long moment, Ella wiping her eyes, Chick waiting patiently. Finally, Ella took a shaky breath. Okay, you'll keep singing. Okay, I won't quit tonight, but I never want to hear that recording again. Chick smiled slightly. Deal. You don't have to listen to recordings. You just have to keep making them. Ella did keep singing. She performed that night at the Savoy. And the next night, and the night after that. Gradually, the sting of hearing herself on the radio faded slightly, though the memory never fully went away. But something fundamental had changed. Ella developed what would become a lifelong aversion to listening to her own recordings. She couldn't stand it. Every time she heard her voice played back on records, on radio, on any recording, she heard that same thin, childish quality that she'd first heard in 1936. Over the years, as Ella became famous, this became a known quirk. Producers would make records with her, but she wouldn't listen to the playbacks. Engineers would ask for her input on mixes, and she'd say, "You decide, I don't want to hear it. Don't you want to know how it sounds?" They'd ask. "I know how it sounds," Ella would say. "It sounds like me, and I don't like how I sound." Friends and fellow musicians found this bizarre. "Ella, you have one of the most beautiful voices in the world. How can you not like listening to yourself?" "I just don't," Ella would say, unwilling to explain the deeper insecurity underneath. In the 1950s and 60s, when Ella was at the height of her fame, recording the Songbook series and winning Grammys, interviewers would sometimes ask about her recording process. "Do you listen back to your takes?" They'd ask, "No, I trust my producer and engineer to tell me if something needs another take, but I don't listen to playbacks." "Why not?" "I don't like how I sound on recordings." Interviewers would laugh, thinking she was being modest. Ella Fitzgerald, internationally recognized as the First Lady of Song, claiming she didn't like her own voice. It had to be false. Modesty, but it wasn't. It was genuine. Ella truly didn't like listening to herself. The voice that millions loved, that critics praised, that won awards and sold millions of records, that was a voice Ella couldn't stand to hear. Norman Granz, who produced many of Ella's most famous recordings, learned early on not to ask her to listen to playbacks. "She'll do a take," Norman would later recall, "and I'll know it's perfect, absolutely perfect. But if I play it back for her, she'll want to do it again because she thinks she sounds thin or weak or whatever. So I stopped playing things back. I'd just tell her, 'That was great, we got it,' and she'd trust me." Didn't she ever want to hear the final product? People would ask Norman. Rarely. She'd hear her own records when they were played on the radio, and she couldn't avoid it. She never sat down and listened to her own albums. She couldn't stand it. The irony was profound. Ella Fitzgerald possessed what many considered the most perfect vocal instrument in popular music. Technical precision, emotional depth, incredible range, perfect pitch. Other singers studied her recordings trying to learn from her technique. Critics analyzed her phrasing. Musicians marveled at her abilities. And Ella heard a thin, childish voice that reminded her of that day in 1936 when she'd first heard herself on playback and wanted to quit. Years later, when Ella was in her 50s and had been singing professionally for decades, a journalist asked her about her early career. "Was there ever a moment when you wanted to give up?" The journalist asked. Ella thought for a moment, then said, "Yes. When I first heard myself on recording, I thought I sounded terrible. I told Chick Webb I wanted to quit. What did he say? He told me I was crazy, that I sounded exactly how I was supposed to sound, that everyone hates their own voice on recordings at first. And did you come to like your voice eventually?" Ella smiled slightly. "No, I still don't like listening to myself, but I learned to trust other people's ears instead of my own. That must be difficult." "It is." But Chick was right about something else too. He said, "The voice I have is the voice I'm supposed to have. So even if I don't like it, I accept it. It's mine." The journalist pressed further. "But surely, with all your success, all the awards, all the recognition, you must have developed some appreciation for your own voice." Ella shook her head. "Success doesn't change what you hear. When I listen to one of my records, I still hear the same things I heard in 1936. Too thin, too light, not rich enough. The fact that other people disagree doesn't change what I hear." This vulnerability, this deep insecurity about her own voice, remained with Ella for her entire life. The voice that others considered flawless was a voice she considered flawed. The recordings that others treasured were recordings she avoided. In her final years, when Ella's health was declining and she could no longer perform, people would visit and want to play her old recordings. "Let's listen to the songbook series," they'd suggest. "Let's hear you at your peak." Ella would politely decline. "I'd rather not." Even at the end, even after 6 decades of universal acclaim, she couldn't bear to listen to herself sing. 18 years old, radio station control room, the first time hearing her own voice on playback. The moment that almost ended her career before it began. Chick Webb had been right. The voice Ella heard that day was the voice that would make her famous, make her legendary, change the course of vocal jazz. But he'd been wrong about one thing. Ella never learned to love that voice. She learned to live with it, to trust others when they said it was beautiful. To accept that her own ears heard something different from what everyone else heard. The voice the world loved was a voice Ella couldn't stand. And perhaps that's what made her sing with such care, such precision, such relentless pursuit of excellence, because she was never satisfied, never convinced, always hearing flaws that others couldn't hear. The insecurity that almost ended her career became the insecurity that drove her to perfection. That thin, childish voice, it became the voice of a legend, even if the legend herself never quite believed it.